Guam is this tiny island, tiny island in the Mariana Islands, halfway between Hawaii and Asia. So the Philippines, Japan, and all this part of the world. So here we have Hawaii, and here we have Guam. That is part of Micronesia. Okay, so just give me a moment. Okay, hold on. Mm. So Guam is this tiny territory in the Pacific Ocean, and it's one of the 5 territories of the US with an established government. Eh, Vi chiederei la cortesia, se sentite delle interferenze sul vostro microfono, di spegnerlo se non lo state utilizzando. In questo modo, diciamo, rendete la lezione più comprensibile, più smooth, come si dice in inglese, per tutti. Allora. We can talk about the territories, about the Commonwealth of the USA, if you're interested in it, if it sounds interesting to you.
Yes,
Oh,
because I don't know anything about geography. I am without notion, without clues. Come si dice? Clues.
yeah, you have no clues about the cultural aspects, about the political aspects related to the US.
You are
Okay.
very kind. I don't know anything about all the world.
Okay, so let's start. Okay, so the legal status of the US territories. So we have the United States of America itself. So the states being part of the US, such as California, New York State, Texas, whatever, all these, all the many states being part of the US, and then we have other territories. Let's focus on the many different aspects of the geography and politics about the US. So territories are not new to the United States. Most states outside the original 13. So fun fact, you can tell the US were originally, well, the US was originally made of 13 states, because nowadays you can find 14 tribes in the American flag. And how do you translate it? Stripe in Italian?
Sì, le strisce.
Strisce.
Mhm. In fact, the American flag is called the stars and stripes flag. Okay.
Cioè, in poche parole, le stelle uguali alle strisce o c'è qualche differenza? Scusa la mia ignoranza,
So the main difference is that the 14 original states can be traced looking at the stripes. So the stripes are the original states, the founding states, while the stars are all the contemporary states. So what nowadays is a state, you'll find it in the stars. Okay.
Ok, thanks.
You're welcome. So the states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois were created from Northwestern Territory. North and South Dakota used to form the Dakota Territory. And in the 20th century, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, Hawaii, and Alaska all made the jump from territory to state. So all these nowadays states used to be territories. Okay. So the creation of territories is addressed in the Constitution and is a power given to Congress. It should be noted, for example, that Washington, D.C. is not a territory, it's a federal district, and that's distinct from a territory. So Washington, D.C., D.C. stands for District of Columbia. So it's a district, it's a federal district, not a state. Okay. Today, there are two criteria that categorize American territories. A territory can be incorporated or unincorporated. A territory can be organized or unorganized. Okay, so the incorporation of US territories. Incorporated territories are considered integral parts of the US. Prior to statehood, both Alaska and Hawaii were incorporated territories. So they are not part of mainland US, but they are American territories. Okay. Just like Alaska and Hawaii used to be before. In incorporated territories, the Constitution is in full effect. Incorporated territories would be similar to territories found in Canada, such as Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Nunavut, or the Northern Territory of Australia. In these places, they do not have a large enough population for statehood, but are still considered part of the parent country. Okay. Today, the US has only one incorporated territory, Palmyra Atoll. Okay. Most people have never heard of Palmyra Atoll, but it's legally the only incorporated territory of the US. It has this status because of a quirk of history. Um, can you understand the word quirk?
No.
So something quirky, I'm gonna write it for you. So something quirky is something weird or unusual.
Mhm.
Or
Strange.
yeah, kind of, yeah.
Mm-mm.
A quirk is like a unique thing happening. Like once in a while aspect,
Mhm.
experience. Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay, so the act of statehood. Okay, so when Hawaii gained statehood in 1959, Palmyra was part of the territory of Hawaii. The Act of Statehood, which admitted Hawaii to the Union, explicitly excluded Palmyra from joining the rest of the Hawaiian Islands from becoming a state. I've searched high and low for an explanation as to why Palmyra was not included with Hawaii as a state, but I could never find a reason. Whatever, okay. So today Palmyra is owned by the Nature Conservancy and has no permanent human settlement. So pretty much no permanent human settlement. So nobody cares about Palmyra. Okay, just keep on reading about real territories, like about important territories, where the human settlements, okay, organization of US territories. The other, the other criterion that defining US territories is the organizational status. Organized territories are territories subject to an organic act passed by Congress, which establishes a government in the territory. Of the five populated territories in the US, four of them have passed an organic act and are organized territories. They are, with the date of organization, PR or Puerto Rico, uh, in in the 1900s, in 1900, in 1900. So the Virgin Islands, 1936, Guam, 1950, and the Northern Mariana Islands in 1978. Citizens of all of the above territories are US citizens. However, they cannot vote in federal elections. They each have a representative in Congress, which cannot vote on the floor, but may vote in committee. Okay. Although American Samoa is a non-organized US territory, it is self-governing. So the only exception is American Samoa. Okay. The remaining US territories are all unorganized. We have the American Samoa, we have the Palmyra Atoll, we have Baker Island, we have Howland Island, we have Jarvis Island, Johnston Atoll, Kingman Reef, Midway Islands, Wake Island, Bajo Nuevo Bank, Navassa Island, and Serranilla Bank. Many of them are in the Caribbean, but most of them are in the Pacific. The majority are in the Pacific. Okay. Okay, all of the unorganized territories, except for American Samoa, are uninhabited and have never had any permanent human population. With American Samoa is officially, while American Samoa is officially unorganized, it is still self-governed and as a government. Citizens of American Samoa are not US citizens, but rather are US nationals. They may live and work anywhere in the US, but they cannot vote should they move to the US. US nationals may apply for citizenship as if they were resident aliens, but they do not have the same restriction for traveling and living in the US as other resident aliens. Radiolab recently published a fascinating podcast exploring how citizens of Samoa feel about their status as nationals and their opinions on the autonomy of being a US territory may surprise you. Is there any word you don't know? Anywhere and anything you didn't understand?
I just was looking for alien. I didn't know that it was forestiero.
Yeah, exactly. Also in
Ah,
Italian, I guess you can say alieno as somebody from outside.
but
Like,
very outside,
yeah, it's like an outsider, you know?
in
Like,
another planet.
yeah. Well, in Italian, we have both, both meanings, but the one like referred to the real aliens, the one coming from another planet, is the most common one. Yeah.
Mm,
Mm. But also in Italian, you can say like for an outsider,
mm,
una persona aliena, una
sì,
persona che, coming from another context.
sì.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
By the way, do you want to see my American driver license?
Ah, wow, you have an
I got
American.
it.
Wow,
Yeah.
nice.
Sì,
Do you see it?
That would be interesting.
poi forse
Let me
lo
see if
vedi.
I
Ah,
can.
ne
$20.
Wow, just $20.
Dai!
Si vede?
Yeah,
No,
can you
pochissimo.
do it
Florida.
slightly upwards?
The, the, the strange thing was that I was asked how tall I was, and I didn't know in feet and inches, and I put 508.
So they just did the conversion, or they just.
I don't know. They decided the 508
I see.
is
Oh,
written here,
it's just a random thing. So I'm
but
not,
I think it's correct. But okay.
probably, yes, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not used to the imperial system, I just know the metric system.
Me too.
Mm-mm-mm.
That's why I couldn't answer, and they did what they
Yeah,
want.
it's quite confusing because even in many, English-speaking countries, and they use the metric system, like Canada, I don't know, South Africa, even Australia, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, also Australia, but I don't know. I heard that there are only three countries in the world. One is the US, and the other two are just like third world countries. Like one, yeah, that's like Liberia in Africa, and maybe I don't know a South American country or something like that.
Mm.
Quite quite interesting, eh?
But
Quite.
it was funny also in Denmark because no. Sorry, not in Denmark. Always in America for the weight. It's
Mhm.
in pounds,
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
it's. I was shocked when I saw 150 pounds.
Yeah, they have like the pounds, the stones, the gallons,
Yeah,
the
the gallons. Yeah, for
it's
liters.
it's quite complicated.
Uh,
It's quite unique. It's quite exotic for somebody who's used to the metric system.
mm.
Okay. So, okay. Uh, if you've ever figured out an online form, you might have seen US minor outlying islands as a counter option in a drop-down list. While that's an official designation for the uninhabited islands, no one actually lives there, so I've never understood why it's included in countries. Yeah, that's an interesting point, huh? Nobody lives there, but even though, even though nobody lives there, there's this option in the drop-down list. Okay.
There is an actual. I didn't understand what you
So
were saying
I'm gonna
about.
translate. Mhm.
You were translating.
No, I just said that's interesting. But even though, you know, in the minor outlying islands,
Uh-huh.
there's not even one inhabitant, nobody lives there, there's still this option.
Okay.
Quite interesting.
Mm.
So, uh, let's focus on the most interesting ones, on the inhabited one, so populated territories of the US. For all practical purposes, the US has 5 territories, those being the ones that are inhabited. With my recent visit to the US Virgin Islands, I've now visited all 5 inhabited territories. Here is a brief view of each territory and some interesting facts about each. Coast. So San Juan is actually the oldest city in the US. Okay. By far the largest US territory, PR, Puerto Rico, has more people than every other territory combined. It's also physically the closest territory to the US mainland. If it were a state, it would be the 29th largest state in terms of population, and it is larger in area than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware. It's also the only US territory that does not have English as its primary language. It became a territory of the US as part of the 1898 Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish-American War. Attitudes in PR have changed considerably over the last century. In the early and mid-20th century, most Puerto Ricans wanted independence from the US. By the 21st century, most Puerto Ricans had family members living and working in the US, and the desire for independence all but disappeared. In 2012, in 2012, the people of PR, for the first time ever, preferred statehood over continuing as a territory in a referendum. It's probably the only current US territory that has any reasonable chance at statehood. Is there any word you don't know here? I don't know. Anything you don't know?
Statehood.
Allora, esistenza in quanto Stato.
Oh, yes.
I guess we don't have a word in Italian, but it's like, yeah, existence as a state, being as a state.
Mm-mm.
So. Here we have Human Bay in Guam. Okay. Guam. Guam became a US territory in 1898 after it was also ceded to the US in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. It is often called the place where America starts its day because it's located on the other side of the international date line. The natives of Guam also inhabit the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam is actually the southernmost island in the Marianas Archipelago. Europeans first visited in 1521 when Ferdinand Magellan landed there on his circumnavigation of the globe. Today, the economy of Guam is mostly tourism, primarily from Japan, and the US military. Military bases cover 29% of the island. One of the most interesting attractions in Guam is Yokoi's Cave. In 1972, Yokoi Shoichi, a Japanese soldier in World War II, emerged from the jungles in Guam unaware that the war was over. Interesting, eh? He became an instant celebrity in Japan, and the hole where he lived is a popular attraction for Japanese tourists today. His story was told by an episode of Gilligan's. Guam was invaded hours after the attack of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and remained under Japanese control for over 2 years. Okay, so the U.S. Virgin Islands. Okay. Unlike PR or Guam, the U.S. didn't acquire American Virgin Islands by conquest. It was purchased from Denmark in 1916 for 25 million dollars in gold via the Treaty of the Danish West Indies. The islands were sold prior to the US entry into World War First, so as to not violate Danish neutrality. The US Virgin Islands lies only 40 miles east of PR and is approximately double the size of District of Columbia. The US VI is the only part of the US that drives on the left, even though almost all vehicles are American and have left-hand drive. The Virgin Islands group is divided between the US and the UK, who control the British Virgin Islands as a territory. There are three primary islands in US VI: St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. The islands of St. Thomas and St. John are connected by ferry, whereas St. Croix is located south of the rest of the islands in the archipelago. Most of the island of St. John consists of Virgin Islands National Park. You can still see some Danish influence on the islands, including some Danish flags. Chartered flights from Denmark in the winter are the fastest direct flights to US VI. Battle of Saipan Monument. CNMI, North Mariana Islands. The Commonwealth of the North Mariana Islands, CNMI, is the newest territory of the US. Although culturally and geographically similar to Guam, the islands have had a very different history, especially in the 20th century. The islands were, like Guam, part of the Spanish Empire. After the Spanish-American War, the islands were ceded to Germany, not the US. In World War I, Japan declared war on Germany and used it as a pretext to invade and take over the islands. The islands were liberated in the Battle of Saipan in World War II, one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater. The islands were put under US management after World War II by the United Nations as part of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, TTPI. Along with what today are Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. Like the other parts of TTPI, the CMMI chose to remain a US territory rather than opt for independence. On several occasions, the citizens of CNMI have voted to join Guam, but they were rejected by Guam. The CNMI has had a reputation of corrupt leadership since it became a territory and is probably the largest destination for sex tourism in the US. When I walked around the capital of Japan, it seemed that almost half of the businesses were massage parlors. So, is there any other word you don't know? Anything?
I was looking for parlor.
Parlor and drum. What did you what did you say?
The last word. Ah, carrozza. Salone, soggiorno. The very last, ecco, massage.
It's like
Salone, club,
yeah,
sala.
it's like a massage place, but like a special massage place.
Okay.
Let's put it this way. A parlor is like place, shop, place, something like that. Okay. Any other word you don't know?
No, it's fine.
So, Pago Harbor in American Samoa. Nice place, eh? Anyway, American Samoa. In the late 19th century, a civil war in Samoa almost led to the US and Germany to go to war. Each nation backed opposite sides in the war in hopes of gaining position to use the islands for whaling as a fueling station. The tripartite, I guess it's the pronunciation convention of 1899 divided the Samoan Islands between the Western Islands, German, and the Eastern Islands. Culturally, there is little difference between American Samoa and the country of Samoa. They are geographically close to each other, and there are many families with relatives in each part. There have been some calls for either independence or greater autonomy for American Samoa. But in a 2010 referendum, the majority of people opted to stick the status quo. With the status quo. Okay. Unlike other US territories.
Alessandro, to stick, rimanere con, cos'è?
Yep,
Stick?
yep, exactly. To stick with something is like to keep with the previous situation. To keep on going with the previous situation. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Unlike other US territories, Americans need a passport to enter American Samoa, and they have it has its own immigration and passport stamps. American Samoa is noted for having the highest rate of military enlistment of any US state or territory. Former US territories. There are currently 4 independent countries that were former territories of the US. One of which came from the Spanish-American War, from which the US acquired Guam and PR. And the other three coming from the aftermath of World War. Can you understand the aftermath?
Say it again. What did you say?
The aftermath.
No, aftermath.
In Italian, we would say lezione, like a situation after a specific event.
Consequenze, consequence. Yes.
Yes and no, yeah. The meaning kind of is on point, but it's somehow different. But it's pretty close, yeah.
Results in this case.
Yeah, exactly. It's like coming as a result of World War II. And okay. A fifth country was not technically a territory, but was instead considered a protectorate. If the Philippines were a US state, it would have a quarter of the population of the combined country. Okay, so another complicated issue is the Cuban one. So Cuba was another part of the territorial transfer from Spain to the US. In 1898, however, Cuba was only a US possession for 4 years. US President Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, was sympathetic to the Cuban independence movement, and the US recognized a free Cuba in 1902. The drink Cuba Libre, aka rum and coke, comes from that period in history. When coke was first imported to Cuba in 1900, it was mixed with rum and people toasted a free Cuba, translated as Cuba Libre in Spanish. Okay. Anything you don't know here? Do you know the meaning of AKA?
No, I wanted to
It's
ask
like it's like alias.
Like what?
Alias, like it's another way, it's another term to mean the same thing.
Asen. And you pronounce it Eka?
AKA.
AKA.
Exactly, yeah.
But altogether you pronounce it
It's just AKA.
AKA. Okay. Like a mix? No.
Yeah, it's like I don't know what it stands for, but it's like a short term. It's like an acronym, and it means that something else is exactly the same thing, just called a different way.
Okay.
You can use it for people, if you say the Mahatma, you can say AKA Gandhi, or you can say Che, AKA, Ernesto Guevara. Yeah, it's this kind of thing. Okay, so the other historical remnant from this period is the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which was released from Cuba. A treaty in 1934 made the lease period indefinite and set the monthly payments at $4,000 $85. The figure was never indexed for inflation, so the amount has never changed, even though the value would have been the equivalent of 69,000 per month in today's dollars. Since the 1959 Cuban Revolution, Cuba has refused to cash with checks as it does not recognize US control over Guantanamo Bay. Anything you don't know here?
Remnant, rimasuglia, residuo.
Well, it needs to be a reminiscenza, but it's like the witness. Mhm. Mhm.
Sì, sì. Quello che è rimasto.
È come una testimonianza, no? O
Sì,
reminiscenza,
giusto.
testimonianza.
Sì, sì, sì.
So, the Philippines. Many people are unaware that the Philippines was once a US territory. It was ceded to the US from Spain in the same treaty that ceded Guam. After the conclusion of the Spanish War, the Filipino forces fighting Spain for independence turned their attention to the Americans. For several years, American and Filipino forces fought, leading to the deaths of thousands on each side. It is one of the most forgotten wars in US history. There were many in the US who never felt comfortable with the annexation of the Philippines. In the 1930s, the Philippines was declared a Commonwealth, and plans were developed for a transition to full independence. The Japanese invasion of Manila on December 1941, at the same time as the Pearl Harbor attack, but on the other side of the international date line, postponed independence for several years. Okay. Any difficult word, any hard word to understand? Easy peasy?
Sì, it was easy.
Okay. So the Philippines eventually became independent on July the 4th, 1946.
Wow.
Today, however, the Philippines celebrates its Independence Day on June the 12th. The date became free of Spain in 1898. During its brief tenure as a US territory, brief compared to Spain's 333-year rule, the Philippines had a non-voting representative in the US Congress and in the US Congress and was covered by an organic giving Filipinos full rights under the US Constitution. Today, if you visit the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., every state and territory is listed in stone pillars, including the Philippines, recognizing its role in the war. The Philippines had remained a US, if the Philippines had remained a US territory and had become a US state, it would be the sixth largest state and the largest state by population. In a fictional world where the Philippines is the 51st state, it would consist of a quarter of the US and have a population almost 3 times larger than California. franchise. Yeah, I guess that the other territories are just like tiny islands. Yeah, I guess so. Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau. So that's of U.S. territories. Historically, most of U.S. territories have gone on to become states. However, most of those were located in North America and were contiguous to the other states. With the admission of Alaska and Hawaii as states in 1959, the idea of non-contiguous and non-North America became real. Of the current US territories, only PR has a reasonable chance of becoming a state. It has a population and landmass that would place it in the realm of current US states. It would be in the middle of states, population-wise and small, but not the smallest state in terms of land area. Of the remaining territories, only the North Mariana Islands have a Rhode Island. The rest are less than ISO. The real reason why you won't see any of the non-PR territory become states is population. The most populous non-PR territory is Guam, which has approximately a quarter the population of Wyoming. The least populous, the rest are as small as a fifth or a tenth of the size. It just isn't enough for most states to justify giving to senators and a representative. Even if they were all to combine, it still probably wouldn't be enough. Okay. The case for PR becoming a state is becoming more interesting. During the 2012 elections, while everyone was focused on the race for president, for the first time, PR quietly had a referendum where the majority of voters approved the idea of statehood. With populational mass within reasonable parameters, the only two stumbling blocks to statehood: economics and language. The per capita GDP of PR $27,384 would make it the poorest state in the Union behind Mississippi, 32,967. While it's poor, it isn't radically so, and probably shouldn't be that big of an issue. Most new states have been on the frontier, where they were poorer than older than more established states. The real issue is language. Spanish is the dominant language in PR. They would be the only state with a non-English speaking majority. While most of the population can speak English, they do so as a second language and at a level of proficiency lower than the rest of the country. Over the last several decades, English proficiency has increased dramatically in PR as more families have relatives that work in the US. I suspect this trend will continue even if Spanish is still the dominant language, since English is an official language of PR and has been since 1902. It should be noted that there are 3 US states that have an official language other than English. Louisiana also has French, New Mexico includes Spanish, and Hawaii officially recognizes Hawaiian. However, in all three states, English is the most widely spoken. That said, during my travels in PR, I've never had problems getting by in English. My guess is that we are still at least 20 years away from Puerto Rican independence. This is most true of American Samoa, which has an independent sister country next door, Samoa. Likewise, if Guam and CNMI would merge, they would be far from the smallest country in the world. Okay. Frequently asked questions about US territories. Is the Philippines a US territory? We already saw they are not. So the Philippines is not a US territory. It was formerly a US territory, but it became fully independent in 1946. Is Guam a US territory? Yes, it is. We saw that. Guam is a U.S. territory. It has been a territory of the U.S. since 1898, since it was ceded to the U.S. by Spain in the Treaty of Paris. The Bahamas, a U.S. territory, no, they are not. They've never been a U.S. territory. They were formerly a territory of the United Kingdom and have been independent since 1973. When did Puerto Rico become a U.S. territory and why? We saw that. Well, the island is about the size of Connecticut. Puerto Rico was first settled by the Spanish in the 1500s. PR has been a territory of the US since 1898 when it was ceded to the US by Spain, whatever. Okay, so on. This handily explains why they speak Spanish in PR, although it's worth noting that since 1917, Puerto Ricans have been full citizens of the US, able to travel freely within the US. How many US territories are there? We saw that 5 territories and 12 uninhabited ones. What territory did the US buy from France in 1803? In 1803, the US purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. Today, the Louisiana Territory no longer exists and is part of the 14 current US states. And there you have it. Okay. Is there any, I don't know, any doubt, any question?
No, interesting.
Did you know some of these aspects, some of these things?
Not all, only partially.
So, did you know, say, for example, that Washington, D.C. is not a state, but a district?
District. Yes, because it's a district of Colombia.
It's a district of Colombia. Yeah, so it makes sense. And what about PR? What about Puerto Rico?
Puerto Rico is an island in the Pacific, no?
No, it's in the Caribbean. It's not.
Caribbean. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
not.
it's true.
It's not far from the Dominican Republic.
It's Guam in the Pacific.
Exactly, Guam is in the Pacific, and Guam is mainly a military base. While, as we saw, Puerto Rico is just like its own country with its own language, its own tradition. They are not. They are not as different as you might imagine from Florida, per se, but they are way, poorer, as we saw in the GDP aspect,
Mhm.
What else? Many tourists from mainland US visit PR, each year, and especially this year is it's one of the few countries they can visit, with no visa, no tight restrictions,
Ah,
because of COVID. Because
ah,
of COVID. It's part of the US.
uh-huh.
Uh, have you ever been to an American territory or to a former American territory such as Hawaii, Alaska, and the Philippines?
Unfortunately not. I was in Barbados recently, but it's Caribbean.
Yeah, it's in the Caribbean, but
Mm.
it's independent. It's not that
Yeah,
far
yeah.
away. It's not that far away from Florida, but still.
And it's close to the Dominica Island. That's not Haiti, the
You mean
Republic of Dominic.
you mean the DR, the Dominican Republic? Mhm.
There is also an island with that name.
Well, no, I'm gonna write
So
it.
give a look.
Domi That's the French territory.
Dominica Republic, but in the Caribbean, there
Yeah,
was also an earthquake recently.
yeah. In that part of the globe, there are many, 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 many different earthquakes,
Mm,
hurricanes,
uh,
and this kind of things. Katrina, is just one of the many. Okay.
mm.
So did you find this test interesting?
Absolutely, yes.
Mm,
Very much. Thank you very much.
thank you. I'm gonna switch
And I
to.
like your pronunciation.
Thank you. Is it easy to understand it? Is it how
Absolutely.
find it?
Very clear and mm, come si può dire? That I can learn of that,
I see. So it's
I can
it's
profit. Huh?
I see. It's definitely not a native speaker accent.
But it's fine.
I
Fine.
mean, my accent, I have an accent of my own, but it's definitely not the standard Italian accent.
No, no.
Sometimes, I'm trying to stress it, just to make it sound harder, but as less Italian as possible.
Yeah.
Because of course, sometimes when I talk to somebody, my accent is gonna be different. But during these lessons, during these classes, I want you to hear like a more standard accent. Of course, I'm not a native speaker. I'll have my pronunciation, but it's quite similar, I hope, to the native one.
But I can feel, I can hear that you spoke a lot in English.
Yeah, I've been to many different English-speaking countries. I watch, movies and videos on YouTube pretty much every day, in English. Therefore, I'm used to the, especially to the American English accent. I've been many times to the UK and I mean to South Africa, where many people have like a Commonwealth accent, so not that different from the British one. Therefore, my accent is like a mix. It's a weird melting pot of different, feel quite similar to the like standard one. I try to have it like to hear the Queen in public speeches. It's not easy to have like the Queen's accent, the most standard accent as possible. Anyway, sometimes I use American words, sometimes I use English words, sometimes even South African words. What I learned in South Africa, in South African English, but still. Anyway, I'm gonna switch to Italian.
Sì, comunque Dominica è anche un'isola lì dei Caraibi, me lo ricordo bene.
Dominique, o in italiano non so se si chiama Dominica o Domenica.
Secondo me è Dominica.
Comunque è un territorio francese, sì.
Sì.
Che è la prima che ho scritto qui. Che però è un po' più spostata, mentre appunto Porto Rico è attaccato alla Repubblica Dominicana, è proprio esattamente di fronte all'isola.
Sì.
Benissimo.
Va bene.
Ci sono altri dubbi, altre cose che vorreste dirmi? Niente?
No.
Grazie Ale, buon appetito.
Grazie
Ciao
a voi.
a
Grazie
tutti.
Alessandro.
Buona serata a tutti.